It is 4:18 yan, Saintis, in the heart of New York City. A religious sanctuary for the fatherless holds $5 million in liquid currency. 122 minors remain confined behind reinforced steel barriers. Systematic exploitation and illicit substances are concealed in plain view. This dramatized chronicle uncovers and denounces atrocities committed against the vulnerable. Allow me to detail the timeline of events. At the break of dawn, the typical warnings never echoed. They were unnecessary. Tactical teams moved with quiet precision as the entrance of a New York facility was breached. The external signage offered a pledge of compassion. Within moments, that deception shattered entirely. Inside the personal quarters of the administrator, Sister Fatima Grace, dozens of officers accessed a fortified wall safe. They discovered $5 million in stacked bills and nearly 5 kilograms of vacuum-packed illegal substances. Then, they reached the sleeping area. On the mattress sat 3 adolescents, approximately 15 or 16 years of age. None of them were dressed. The atmosphere turned cold. Fatima Grace stood paralyzed and speechless as authorities secured the perimeter. There were no sirens or defenses, only undeniable evidence. Further down the corridor, behind a deadbolt, investigators found over 120 children crammed into a single unit. They lay on thin mats without windows or adequate ventilation. Some wept, while others stared blankly, as if expression itself had long been prohibited. In a single sunrise operation, a house of charity was revealed to be a massive crime scene. Yet, this was merely the beginning. What investigators discovered next left no room for doubt. If you believe the truth deserves to be told, express your support below and stay with us. The findings following the initial sweep proved this was no mere administrative failure. It was a sophisticated criminal enterprise masking itself as a humanitarian effort. Behind a fortified interior wing, tactical units breached a heavy door to find over 100 minors in a room meant for 30. There were no apertures for light. Oxygen levels were dangerously low. Used mats covered every inch of the floor. Children slept in cramped proximity without any sense of personal space or sunlight. Many had not seen the outdoors for several months. Medical personnel reported a pattern of extreme neglect. 72% of the minors exhibited clear symptoms of severe malnutrition. Dozens suffered from untreated infections that required immediate stabilization. 19 tested positive for the forced administration of heavy sedatives. Ages spanned from early childhood to late adolescence. Many were unable to track the passage of time. Some had entirely lost their sense of the current date. Internal ledgers detailed how this operation persisted without government detection. The facility collected roughly $34 million every month from religious donors and online fundraising. Over a 5-year period, total revenue surpassed $2 billion. Still, expenditures on nutrition were negligible. There was no evidence of a legitimate educational curriculum. Healthcare was provided only when it facilitated the operation's goals rather than the children's health. Detectives then found internal records where the minors were categorized like inventory. Young girls were monitored by their age. When they turned 18, specific departure dates were assigned. Official files claimed they were adopted or returned to families. In reality, at least 39 girls were surreptitiously moved into external illicit networks. Boys were managed under a different protocol. Documentation indicated frequent solitary confinement and constant physical evaluations. Subsequent testimony confirmed a long history of exploitation hidden behind a facade of authority. As boys approached adulthood, their records simply ceased, marked as removed. No final destinations or follow-up logs existed. Hidden storage units eventually provided the final, harrowing confirmation. Surgical instruments, blood supplies, specialized refrigeration, and medical transport containers were all recovered. No legitimate home for children should ever possess such equipment. This was not a sanctuary. It was a logistics hub where public empathy generated capital and capital generated absolute power. Minors were reduced to mere assets, kept silent and hidden until they were no longer profitable. If you feel children should never be treated as property, share this report before we proceed. Silence is exactly how these dark systems endure. The trail of evidence extended far beyond the city limits. It led toward a landscape of steel, concrete, and high-stakes conflict. 30 miles outside the city, past industrial zones and isolated roads, surveillance confirmed a fortified stronghold. It was linked to an international criminal organization. From a bird's-eye view, it appeared to be a standard shipping depot. On the ground, it functioned as a fortress. It featured reinforced masonry, watchtowers, advanced sensors, and armed patrols on a strict rotation. Inside lay the missing components of the operation: drug manufacturing, human trafficking logistics, and surgical facilities. Intercepted data suggested hundreds of captives were currently being held alive. At 3:42 a.m., the intervention commenced. Stealth drones mapped heat signatures through the concrete walls. Infrared optics confirmed the positions of at least 120 armed combatants. Many were experienced mercenaries equipped with automatic weaponry. Federal commanders issued the order for a full tactical entry. The primary explosion leveled the main gates. Engagement began immediately. Tracing fire illuminated the darkness as heavy tactical vehicles breached the perimeter. Rapid-fire systems suppressed enemy positions. Helicopters circled above, pinning targets under intense spotlights. The opposition returned fire from elevated positions, turning the area into a high-intensity combat zone. Inside the compound, teams cleared the structure room by room. In a central hallway, a federal officer sustained multiple injuries. Rounds struck his upper and lower body. He refused to be evacuated. Despite his wounds, he held his position to provide cover for his teammates moving forward. Helmet cameras recorded his steady voice through the crisis. "Move ahead! I have the rear." The conflict peaked near the subterranean levels. Criminal forces attempted to incinerate incriminating data. They targeted the labs and holding areas. Units pushed through thick smoke as the building shook from structural charges. In one secluded chamber, they located dozens of individuals bound together in the dark. Medics administered care, while tactical teams maintained a defensive line. After 40 minutes of heavy resistance, the opposition finally collapsed. Over 200 combatants were either neutralized or taken into custody. Federal forces secured the facility and documented the massive scale of the enterprise. They found tons of narcotics, weapon caches, and mobile surgical units. Most significantly, hundreds of captives were found alive. As the sun rose, medical transports lined the area. Adolescents and adults who had vanished without a trace were finally identified. One by one, they were moved into safety. The stronghold had been dismantled. However, the discovery would deeply affect every investigator involved. This was more than a criminal hideout. It was a well-funded industrial machine designed to harvest human lives for profit. Federal agents neutralized one cell, but the network spanned much wider. Support our efforts to expose these financial structures by subscribing. Once the tactical operation concluded, the focus shifted to the money. The financial data was staggering. Analysts began by auditing the public records of the religious facility. Officially, It was one of the most successful nonprofits in the country. Monthly revenue averaged over $30 million from churches and private foundations. During a 5-year span, billions of dollars flowed through tax-exempt accounts. When agents followed the actual path of the currency, the facade crumbled. Less than 8% of funds went toward basic needs. There was no funding for education or licensed staffing. Medical costs were paid to shell companies and never touched the children's actual health. The remaining capital vanished into a labyrinth of offshore accounts and digital wallets. Every path led back to the same financial clearinghouse. Cartel accountants had infiltrated the very heart of the charity's structure. Charitable donations were commingled with illicit revenue. Legitimate funds masked the origins of criminal money. The inflated wealth of the charity then attracted even more public support. It was a closed loop of exploitation. Human sympathy was converted into capital. Capital was then converted into absolute control. Internal memos detailed monthly inventory projections. The terminology used was chilling. Children were listed alongside revenue targets. Their physical state and transfer dates were tracked with mathematical precision. The facility was not a home. It was a warehouse for human capital. Drug production at the separate compound provided the next financial layer. High-potency substances produced there were moved across the eastern seaboard. The resulting profits were cycled back into the facility as anonymous donations. In short, narcotics funded the abuse, and the abuse facilitated the narcotics trade. Detectives also found evidence of bribes used to suppress oversight. Inspectors were intentionally delayed. Community complaints were scrubbed from records. Building violations were conveniently ignored. Every hurdle had a specific price. And the group paid it without hesitation. The organization's religious status prevented standard audits. Its public prestige discouraged any meaningful inquiry. One internal document summarized the strategy in a single sentence. Diversification minimizes institutional risk. Multiple revenue streams ensured that the loss of one would not stop the others. For years, no single department saw the complete picture. Social services saw only an overcrowded building. Regulators saw a thriving nonprofit. Local law enforcement saw no standing complaints. Each individual piece seemed like a manageable issue. Together, they formed a criminal empire of historic proportions. This was not the result of simple greed. It was a deliberate system of exploitation financed by money moving faster than the law. By the time the truth emerged, the cost was measured in stolen lives. If you have ever donated to a cause, ask yourself who is truly monitoring the funds. To understand the origin, investigators had to look at the founder. The architect of this scheme did not start as a criminal. Before the cartel ties and the massive wealth, Fatima Grace was a low-income caregiver. Records show she once worked informal jobs just to survive. Years prior, she had taken in abandoned infants out of a sense of duty. Early photographs show a modest life and genuine effort. Neighbors once described her as a devout and sincere woman. Then her story gained national attention. A brief clip went viral showing her in religious attire, advocating for forgotten children. The public reaction was overwhelming. Donations began to flood her bank accounts. National organizations shared her message. Within a few months, thousands of dollars turned into millions. Her first error was assuming the spotlight would eventually fade. It only intensified. As the wealth grew, her personal authority became absolute. Accountability vanished. Public praise replaced necessary oversight. Volunteers stopped questioning the lack of transparency. When critics mentioned overcrowding, they were shamed for attacking a saint. Fatima realized that visible virtue could be used to silence all suspicion. By the time the facility became a massive institution, the change was total. Children arrived much faster than the available resources. Totalitarian control replaced the original care. Harsh rules took the place of empathy. Discipline eventually turned into systemic punishment. Cruelty became a standard operating procedure. Investigators eventually found the exact turning point. It was the first meeting with intermediaries from the international syndicate. What started as security consulting evolved into financial and logistical partnerships. Fatima was manipulated into the criminal world in small, digestible steps. She was told the money would secure the future of her mission. Instead, the money became the mission itself. Records showed how the internal vocabulary shifted. Names were replaced by categories and age brackets. Notes of compassion were swapped for metrics of efficiency. Monthly reports tracked stock capacity and loss rates. Every typed word moved the operation further from its moral core. Witnesses confirmed that Fatima personally managed the system. She authorized every transfer and removal. She demanded absolute silence from her subordinates. When staff raised concerns, she claimed that obedience was a spiritual requirement. Following her arrest, she provided no logical defense for her actions. She spoke only of a higher purpose that only she understood. Evidence, however, showed no signs of external coercion. Every decision was her own, calculated for maximum profit. She did not transform into a villain overnight. She became one through 1,000 small, rewarded choices. By the time the raid happened, mercy had been replaced by a machine. It was a system that consumed the very people it was built to help. When the dust settled, the true damage became visible. It wasn't found in bank accounts, but in the children who survived. Emergency units processed hundreds of victims over 2 days. Most were severely dehydrated and underweight. Several had skeletal injuries that had never been properly set. Others carried scars from procedures that had no medical justification. Psychologists observed a consistent pattern of trauma. There was a lack of emotional affect and a fear of making eye contact. These minors had been trained to believe that silence was their only protection. Medical reviews confirmed a history of long-term physical harm. Frequent sedation had impaired their cognitive development. Hormonal issues were prevalent across the group. In older boys, the signs of invasive procedures matched the equipment found at the lab. For many, the physical recovery will take a lifetime. Some may never truly heal. The mental scars were even more profound. Children described being transported in the dark without warning. They were known only by numbers and punished without cause. Their capacity for trust had been intentionally destroyed. When asked why they never cried for help, one child simply said, "No one ever came." Federal services worked tirelessly to find safe placement for the survivors. Each minor was flagged as a high-priority victim. New identities and relocation strategies were developed. In many instances, returning to their original families was not an option. Relatives had either been compromised or were non-existent. As the children were stabilized, forensic teams analyzed the recovered data. Hard drives revealed a massive global trafficking network. The scope was much larger than the New York facility alone. The orphanage had served as a primary hub for a much larger system. What was dismantled was only a single part of a global artery. Legal battles would span several years. Assets would eventually be seized and repurposed. None of that can restore the years that were lost. For the survivors, the path back starts with very small things: eating when hungry and sleeping without the sound of a lock. They are learning that doors can open toward freedom. Some children asked the same unanswerable questions. In a temporary home, One boy watched the world from a window for the first time in years. He didn't say a word as he watched the life he had missed. The machine had been stopped, but the journey was just beginning. Freedom is a fragile and heavy thing for those who have lived in the dark. Investigators will always be haunted by the time that was stolen. This narrative doesn't conclude with just a few arrests. The environment that allowed this to happen was built on societal neglect. Every year, thousands of children enter the system because they are overlooked. Some are left at hospitals or emergency stations. Others are simply forgotten by the world. Behind every statistic is a quiet, desperate decision. Modern society rarely focuses on the aftermath of these lives. We argue over policy, but ignore the children who are discarded by the system. The foster infrastructure is currently overwhelmed. Group homes lack the necessary staff and funding. Caseworkers are pushed to their breaking point. Oversight fails not because of bad intent, but because of systemic exhaustion. That void creates a perfect environment for predators to operate. Criminal networks target those with no one to speak for them. They look for the runaways and the children with no records. When the government loses track, the shadow economy finds them. This is the reality that rarely makes the headlines. Charity is often used as a poor substitute for actual policy. Empathy is high, but real accountability is low. We tell ourselves that donating is enough until it isn't, We let places of safety turn into warehouses for assets. Responsibility doesn't belong to just one criminal actor. It belongs to a culture that treats the vulnerable as a secondary concern. We fund the legal system faster than we fund child welfare. We prioritize ideology over actual prevention. Children do not choose to be born into chaos. They do not choose to be silenced. If we do not protect them, someone with darker motives certainly will. This case was an extreme example, but the factors are common. Underfunded services and weak oversight are the norm. Religious and charitable shields often block necessary scrutiny. Each gap in the system seems small until they all align. Real protection requires a proactive and transparent approach. It requires supporting families before they reach a breaking point. It requires monitored alternatives and a refusal to look away. These children were failed by every layer of the system designed to help them. Until we treat every child as a shared duty, the shadows will remain. Somewhere, another door is closing on a child who thinks no one is coming. That is the cycle that must be broken. This account ends where many others do not, with the truth. What stopped this was not a stroke of luck. It was the unwavering discipline of American law enforcement. They acted when the cost of waiting became too high. The agents who entered that building didn't know what they were facing. They moved forward anyway, choosing duty over their own comfort. They chose evidence over excuses and protection over silence. That matters because these systems do not simply disappear. They thrive in the spaces where no one is willing to look. In this instance, investigators followed the facts regardless of where they led. They coordinated their efforts and took immense risks. This is the definition of public service at its best. But the raid itself is not the final answer. The lesson is that vigilance must be a constant state. Protection cannot only be a reaction to a tragedy. Oversight must be permanent, and compassion must be audited. Every institution with power over children must be watched. The people who brought those children into the light did their part. Now, the burden shifts to the rest of us to ask the hard questions. If you believe that protecting the innocent is a non-negotiable duty, support this message. If you want to see the truth exposed, join the conversation below. If you value stories that highlight courage and the rule of law, subscribe for more. Justice begins with your attention, and as long as people are watching, the shadows have nowhere to hide.